Good evening, night creatures. Tonight we tell a tale of Hephaestus, who is known as the Greek god of fire, metallurgy, and all sorts of craftsmen. Relax and slowly drift off to sleep while we listen to this epic tale. The Fires of the Lame God, a tale of Hephaestus. Prologue. Before the forge was lit. In the age before ages, when the world was still learning the shape of itself, when mountains had not yet decided how tall they wished to be, and the seas had not yet agreed upon their boundaries, the gods of Olympus lived in a kind of luminous chaos. They were perfect and terrible, beautiful and cruel, wise and petty all at once. For divinity, it turns out, does not automatically confer goodness. It only confers power, and power without goodness is one of the most dangerous things in any universe, mortal or divine. The Olympians feasted, they quarreled, they loved and betrayed and conspired. They looked down upon the world of mortals the way children sometimes look at anthills, with a mixture of fascination, careless affection, and the occasional destructive impulse. They were, in almost every meaningful way, a family, which is to say, they were bound together by blood and history and love and resentment in proportions that shifted daily. And like all families, they had secrets, wounds passed down from parent to child, silences that spoke louder than thunder, a child thrown from a great height, and the question, never fully resolved, never fully spoken, of why. This is the story of that child. This is the story of Hephaestus. Part 1. The Fall. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Unwanted. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, goddess of marriage and women and the sacred bonds of family. Oh, the irony of that last title never escaped anyone who knew her well. Had reasons to be angry. She had always had reasons to be angry. Her husband, the great thundering king of gods, was incapable of fidelity. He loved women the way the sea loves coastlines, constantly, hungrily, destructively, and without any particular loyalty to one shore over another. The children born of his wandering affections were everywhere. Athena had sprung fully formed from his head, armored and brilliant, goddess of wisdom and warcraft, and Hera had been expected to simply accept this, to smile and love the daughter of her husband's strange parthenogenesis, to welcome into her home this walking symbol of Zeus's self-sufficiency, his ability to create without her, to need nothing from her at all. She had not smiled, she had seethed. And so, in a fury that was equal parts wounded pride and genuine creative power, Hera had decided to produce a child of her own, alone, without Zeus, without his seed, without his involvement in any form. She would demonstrate that she needed nothing from him either. She would create life from her own divine essence, from the force of her will and her godhood, and that child would be hers entirely. Proof that she was complete, sufficient, whole. The creation had taken effort that even a goddess found exhausting. She had poured her essence into it, concentrated her power in ways she had never done before, bent the rules of divine generation through sheer, stubborn will. She had prayed to the deep forces, older than the Olympians, older than the Titans even, the primordial forces of creation that preceded everything with a name. And when it was done, when the child came into being in a flash of divine power, Hera looked at what she had made, and something in her face changed. Later, she would say the child had been born wrong, malformed, a divine error, a mistake in the sacred geometry of creation. Later, she would say she had acted out of disgust, out of the proper horror any god should feel at imperfection in the divine realm. Later, she would construct many stories around that moment, and she told them so many times that she may have eventually believed them herself. But what she had really felt in that first unguarded instant was fear. Because the child looked at her, this newborn god, this impossible creation of her lone will, and his eyes were already ancient, already knowing, already seeing something in his mother that she did not want seen. He was not beautiful, as gods were supposed to be. He had been born with a crooked leg, the left one bent at an angle that would never straighten, that would give him a lurching gait for all eternity. His hands, though, his hands were extraordinary. Even newborn, they flexed and grasped with a precision and strength that was remarkable. His face was broad and honest and kind, with none of the cool magnificence of the other Olympians. He looked, to be perfectly honest, like someone who would be good at making things. Hera did not want someone who would be good at making things. She had wanted proof of her power, a symbol of her independence, a weapon in her cold war with Zeus. She had wanted a child who would reflect her own glory back at her. She had gotten Hephaestus, and because he was not what she had wanted, because he made her feel something she could not name and would not examine, because his knowing eyes disturbed her in ways she refused to articulate, even to herself, she threw him away. The act was simple, as the worst acts often are. A gathering of the child in her arms, a walk to the edge of Olympus, that shining peak above clouds, above reason, above the ordinary laws of the world. And then a release, an unclenching of divine fingers, a letting go. Hephaestus fell. Chapter 2. The Long Fall. He fell for a day and a night. This is not metaphor. This is not poetic exaggeration. In the divine reckoning of that age, the fall from Olympus to earth was genuinely that long. A tumbling, turning descent through layers of sky, through clouds that tasted of lightning, through the cold, bright emptiness of upper air, through the warmer, thicker atmosphere below. For a mortal, the fall would have been over in minutes, ended in a red ruin on whatever hillside happened to be below. But Hephaestus was a god, and gods do not die from falling. They arrive. He was aware for much of it. This is the part of the story that the poets sometimes skip, because it is uncomfortable. The image of a newborn god, hours old, already betrayed, turning slowly through the sky, with those ancient eyes open and watching the world spin around him. What does a divine mind, newborn and vast and suddenly alone, think about during a fall that long? We cannot know entirely, but we can guess at some of it. He would have seen the world from above, which is a perspective few creatures ever get. He would have seen the wrinkled backs of mountains, the silver threads of rivers, the dark immensity of seas. He would have seen, in the miniature that distance creates, the first fumbling settlements of humans, those improbable animals who had been given fire not long before, who were still learning what to do with it, who were building and burning and building again, with a persistence that was either admirable or absurd, depending on how you looked at it. He would have had time to feel the abandonment fully, to turn it over in his infant ancient mind, to begin the long process of understanding what it meant that the first pair of hands to hold him had also been the hands that cast him away. And somewhere in that long fall, something hardened in him, not into bitterness, that would come later, and be overcome later, and perhaps never fully overcome, but into something else, a resolution, a decision so fundamental it did not even feel like a decision, but like a discovery of what he already was. He would make things. He would make things so extraordinary, so beautiful, so useful and clever and intricate, that the world would not be able to ignore him. He could not be beautiful himself, could not charm his way into acceptance, could not compete with the golden grace of Apollo or the terrible magnetism of Ares. But he could make beautiful things. He could take raw material, any raw material, and transform it into something that had never existed before. He would be a maker, the maker, and the things he made would speak for him, would carry his worth into the world, would demonstrate his value in ways his crooked leg and broad, unheroic face could not. The resolution settled into him somewhere above the island of Lemnos, which was approaching with increasing speed from below. He hit the water just off the coast and sank like a stone. Chapter 3. Lemnos. The people of Lemnos were sea people, coast people, people accustomed to the water giving up unexpected things. They pulled nets from the Aegean that contained fish and occasionally other items. Strange debris, artifacts of distant places. Once a chest of cedar wood that had traveled so far. No one could say where it originated. They were not prepared for the young god who washed ashore that morning, limping out of the waves with a crooked leg and ancient eyes, looking dazed but undrowned. The women found him first. This is how it was recorded, and it matters. Women, not men, who encountered something strange and hurt and different and chose to help rather than fear. A fisherwoman named Thetis, not the sea goddess Thetis, just a woman who shared a name with the divine, brought the child to her home. And the people of Lemnos took him in. He was strange. Even they, who did not know what a god looked like, could feel that he was different. There was something in him that vibrated at a frequency slightly outside the normal range of human experience. When he touched metal, even raw, unworked ore, he seemed to understand it in ways that went beyond knowledge. It was as if the metal recognized him, as if there was a conversation happening at a level below perception. He grew quickly, as divine children do, but not in the unnerving flash of instantaneous adulthood that the poets sometimes describe. It was still faster than mortal growth, weeks where there should have been years, but gradual enough that the people of Lemnos could follow it, could watch him change, could begin to understand what he was. He was a smith. He was a craftsman. He was something that had never quite existed before. Chapter 4. The First Forge. He built the forge himself. This seems obvious in retrospect, but it was not obvious at the time. The people of Lemnos had metal workers. They were not primitive. They worked bronze and knew the basics of smelting. But what Hephaestus built bore the same relationship to their workshops that a palace bears to a lean-to. He chose a location first, spending days walking the island, laboriously because of his leg, but with a patience that seemed inexhaustible. He was looking for something specific, and he knew it when he found it. A place where the volcanic rock beneath the island was close to the surface, where the Earth's own heat seeped upward, where natural vents could be persuaded to become something more structured, more directed, more useful. The people of Lemnos watched him work and understood perhaps 10% of what they were seeing. He dug. He shaped stone with his hands in ways that should have been impossible, pressing and smoothing rock as if it were clay still warm from the kiln. He built bellows from materials he requested specifically, leather of certain thicknesses, wood of certain grains, and connected them to the natural vents in the rock in a system that took the Earth's own exhalation and concentrated it into a directed blast capable of achieving temperatures that ordinary forge fires could never reach. The anvil he made himself, pouring molten bronze and then working it while it was still hot in a process he seemed to invent on the spot, each step following from the last, with an inevitability that suggested he was not inventing at all, but remembering, as if the knowledge of how to make things was native to him, built into the divine essence that Hera had concentrated into his creation. When the forge was complete, he stood in front of it for a long time, watching the fire he had called into being in the specially shaped hearth. The light of it played across his broad face and made him look for the first time something close to beautiful, not conventionally, not the cold marble beauty of Apollo, not the terrifying radiance of Zeus, but with the beauty of someone looking at the thing they were made to do. He raised a hammer. He had made the hammer too, in those first days. A thing of such perfect balance that it seemed to move by itself, seemed to swing with an accuracy that went beyond skill into something more like instinct. He brought it down on the first piece of raw metal, and everything began. Part 2. The Work. Chapter 5. What he made. In the years that followed, and time on Lemnos was mortal time, measured in seasons and the aging of people he had known as children, Hephaestus made everything. He made tools first, farming tools, because Lemnos was an island that fed itself, and the soil was stubborn. He made plows with edges that held their sharpness through 10 seasons of use. He made sickles that curved with such geometric precision that the grain practically leapt into the hand of the harvester. These were not magical objects in the obvious divine sense. They did not glow or speak or grant wishes, but they worked better than anything made before them, because they were made with perfect understanding of what they needed to do. He made fishing equipment, hooks of such fine workmanship that even old fishermen who had spent their lives gauging the quality of such things would hold his hooks and shake their heads and ask how. He made needles and combs and pins, objects so small and so precisely formed that the women of Lemnos would show them to each other with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred things. He made armor when a dispute with a neighboring island threatened to become violent. Armor that fit its wearer perfectly, that moved with the body rather than against it, that distributed the weight of protection so evenly that a soldier wearing it felt lighter than he did in ordinary clothes. He made the dispute unnecessary by making such clearly superior armor that the neighboring island decided negotiation was the better option. He made a gate for the main settlement that opened and closed with a counterweight system so elegant that children would spend entire afternoons playing with it, swinging it back and forth, just to feel the smooth inevitability of its motion. And in the evenings, when the forge had cooled and the settlement had quieted, he made things that served no purpose, except to be beautiful. A silver bird, jointed at every feather, that could be wound with a small key, and would then hop and turn its head and open its beak in a perfect mimicry of the live sparrows that populated the island's olive groves. A bowl of hammered bronze in which he had depicted, in relief so fine it required daylight and close examination to fully appreciate, every creature of the sea, accurate in every detail, beautiful in their arrangement, alive in the way that great art makes still things seem to breathe. A crown of golden flowers, each petal separately formed and then joined to the stem, with a hinge so small it was nearly invisible, so that the petals moved in the slightest breeze, the way real flowers did, which was to say, each one slightly differently, with the beautiful unpredictability of living things. He gave this to the fisherwoman who had pulled him from the water, who was old now, who had grandchildren who played around her feet. She wore it on feast days and was buried in it, and her grandchildren described it to their grandchildren, and the description eventually became a legend. And the legend became one of those stories that gets told around fires on winter nights, on islands where the sea is loud. Chapter 6. The First Helpers. The automatons came from one of those late-night sessions when the forge burned low, and Hephaestus was working through a problem he could not quite articulate. The problem was this: some work required more hands than he had. Specifically, work that required holding a piece in position while simultaneously hammering it, or work that required two different operations to happen at precisely the same time. He had learned to work around these limitations. The ingenuity he applied to such problems was itself a form of craft. But the workarounds always cost something: efficiency, precision, possibility. He was not sure when the idea came to him. He was working late, the forge glow painting everything amber and shadow, and he was thinking about the silver bird, about how the mechanism inside it created the illusion of independent action, how the wound spring's energy was directed through carefully shaped parts into the appearance of choice. He was thinking about what would happen if you made the mechanism larger, more complex. If instead of a spring you used something else, some form of stored energy, some principle of self-continuation that he did not yet have a name for, but could feel at the edges of his understanding, like a shape seen through fog. He worked for 3 days without sleeping, which was possible for a god in a way it is not for mortals. The forge never cooled. The hammering was constant, and the people of the settlement nearby learned to sleep through it, the way coast dwellers learn to sleep through the sound of waves. What emerged was not immediately impressive. It was a rough figure of hammered bronze, man-shaped but clearly not a man, with joints that were visible and mechanical, with no pretense of skin or hair. It was about 2/3 the height of a human adult. When he connected the final piece, a small device at its core that he had worked on longest, that contained some essence of divine creative force that he had drawn from himself at significant cost, feeling the giving away of it like a small depletion. The figure shuddered, stood, looked at him, or rather, oriented toward him, because it had no eyes, just sensing apparatus of polished silver that could detect heat and movement and sound. He had made it to help at the forge. Simple tasks, holding pieces in position, working the bellows at a steady rhythm, fetching and carrying materials. He gave it instructions by demonstration, showing it what he needed while it observed, and then watching as it attempted to replicate the action. It was clumsy at first, dramatically clumsy, in a way that would have been funny if it had not cost him so much of himself. It dropped things and misjudged distances, and once walked directly into the forge wall with a clang that echoed across the settlement. But it learned, and this was the part that surprised even Hephaestus, who had made the thing. It learned in a way that felt organic, felt like growth rather than mere adjustment. Each day it was less clumsy. Each day its movements were more precise. Within a month it was working the bellows with a steadiness and rhythm no human could sustain, maintaining perfectly consistent pressure for hours without variation or fatigue. He made others, each one slightly different from the last, each one incorporating lessons learned from the previous. He made them in different sizes for different tasks. He made some with more sophisticated sensing apparatus, some with tool-holding attachments rather than hands. He made one, his most ambitious, which took him the better part of a year, that could perform simple forge work itself, hammering to specifications under his direction. He called them his helpers, in the way one might call tools by a familiar name. But he treated them with a care that exceeded what tools warranted, maintaining them with the same attention he gave to his own instruments, repairing damage with the same priority he would give to a human injury. This was noticed. The people of Lemnos had many questions about the bronze figures, and most of those questions, underneath their surface strangeness, were really one question: are they alive? He never answered this directly. He was not sure he knew the answer. Chapter 7. The Net. It was in this period, the years on Lemnos, the building years, that Hephaestus made the net. This was not the famous net, the one that would later catch Ares and Aphrodite in their betrayal. This was the first net, the practice net, the net he made for himself and never showed to anyone. He had been thinking about his mother. He had been thinking about his mother for years, in the way that thoughts about profound wounds return, regardless of how determinedly you turn away from them. He would be working on something beautiful, something that required all his concentration, and the thought would surface anyway. She threw me away. He had built, over the years, an understanding of the event that was more complex than simple hurt. He understood that Hera had her own wounds, her own reasons, her own relationship with Zeus that had made her into someone capable of that act. He understood that the story was not simply about him, that he had been, in some terrible way, incidental to a conflict that predated him, that would have happened regardless of what he was or was not. He understood all of this, and he was still hurt. Both things were true. The net he made was not made for revenge. This is important. He was not, at his core, a revenge maker. He was a problem solver, and the problem he was solving with the net was not how do I punish Hera, but how do I make her listen to me? Because what he wanted, what he had wanted from the beginning, from the long fall, from the moment of first awareness, was not vengeance. It was recognition. It was for his mother to look at him the way she had not been able to look at him in that first moment, to see him without flinching, to acknowledge that he existed and that his existence had value. He wanted her to know him. The net was made of a metal so fine it was nearly invisible, individual strands thinner than thread, woven with a precision that made cloth look crude by comparison. It was made to be unbreakable, which required a metallurgical understanding he had been working toward for years, a way of treating the individual strands in the forge that changed their essential nature, made them capable of absorbing force rather than resisting it, bending around it like water around a stone. He made it alone over the course of many months, in the evenings after the main work was done. He made it in pieces and then joined the pieces, and the joining was the hardest part, making the net continuous, seamless, without the weak points that junctions always created. When it was done, he held it up to the forge light and watched the light pass through it, making patterns on the floor that shifted as he moved. It was beautiful. It was also deadly in its implications. Something this strong, this invisible, this flexible, could hold anything. He put it away. He was not ready to use it yet. He was not sure he would ever be ready to use it, or whether the using of it would actually give him what he wanted. He went back to work. Chapter 8. Word travels upward. The gods of Olympus were not paying attention to Lemnos. Why would they? It was a small island, important mainly to the people who lived on it. The gods had larger concerns: the affairs of great cities, the fates of heroes, the ongoing soap opera of their own relationships. But word travels in ways that are difficult to predict, and word of Hephaestus's work eventually traveled upward to the mountain. It came first through the mortals, heroes who had encountered his armor, merchants who had seen his bronze work, sailors who had stopped at Lemnos and been shown the silver bird or the articulated fish in the bowl. They brought these stories to temples, told them as offerings alongside wine and blood, and the gods who listened at those temples began to pay attention. Hermes heard it first, because Hermes heard everything first. He described to the assembled Olympians the reports of a maker on Lemnos, whose work exceeded anything mortals had previously achieved, who seemed to understand metal and fire in a way that went beyond skill into something divine. Zeus listened. Zeus, who had not been told of Hera's pregnancy, who had not witnessed the creation or the casting away, who had simply one day noticed that Hera seemed angrier than usual and attributed it to the usual causes, found himself interested in this story. Hera listened. Hera's face, when the description of the Lemnian craftsman became detailed enough, became very still in the way that faces become still when they are working hard not to show something. Ares listened and was uninterested. Swords, yes. Whatever. Aphrodite listened, and in her eyes there was something that was not quite an expression, more the suggestion of one, like the first movement of water before a wave. Athena listened with genuine interest, because she was, among other things, a goddess of crafts, and she recognized in the described work a quality that commanded respect. "Find out who this is," Zeus said. He said it casually, the way powerful people say things that they expect will be attended to. Send someone to Lemnos. Hermes went. He was the logical choice. He moved easily between worlds, between registers of existence, comfortable in mortal spaces and divine ones equally. He went as a traveler, as he often did, wearing the dust of the road and carrying his staff wound with serpents. He found Hephaestus at the forge, and he understood immediately, with the quick comprehension that was his divine gift, what he was looking at. He understood that this broad, dark, limping figure, standing at the anvil, was not a mortal craftsman who had been blessed with unusual talent. He understood that this was a god, felt the divinity the way you feel the difference between a fire and the sun, a matter of kind rather than degree. And he understood, from the shape of the face, from certain angles and expressions, whose god this was. He went back to Olympus without speaking to Hephaestus. He needed to think about what to say to Zeus. Part 3. Olympus. Chapter 9. The Throne. The story that is most often told, the one the poets reached for, begins with the throne. Hephaestus sent it to Olympus as a gift, a throne of gold, inlaid with every precious thing the earth produced, shaped with an understanding of the divine form that only a divine craftsman could have achieved. It was, by every account, the most beautiful object anyone on Olympus had ever seen. And Olympus had seen considerable beauty, being the home of gods who had been collecting beautiful things since before human civilization had learned to count past 10. Hera received it. Hera sat in it and was caught. The net, the first net, the practice net he had made in those quiet evenings at Lemnos, was woven into the throne itself, invisible until activated, and it activated the moment weight settled into the seat. Strands of unbreakable metal flowed over and around her, not violently, not painfully, but with absolute certainty. She could not rise. She could not use her power to break free. The net had been made to absorb divine force, as well as physical. The harder she pushed, the more securely she was held. The Olympians found her this way, and were confronted with something that had no precedent. Their queen, trapped by a piece of furniture. There was an embarrassed interval. Various gods attempted various solutions. None of them worked. Ares, whose approach to problems was consistent, if not always effective, attempted physical violence against the throne, and was surprised to find that his considerable divine strength made no impression on metal that simply flexed around each blow. Who made this? Athena asked, and she already knew, and her voice had in it something that was not quite admiration, but was in its neighborhood. No one sent for Hephaestus. Sending for him would have been an acknowledgement that they needed him, and acknowledgement was not something the Olympians managed gracefully. Instead, Zeus said, in the tone of someone who expects to be obeyed, that the craftsmen of Lemnos should be invited to Olympus. Hermes went back to the island. Chapter 10. The Invitation. The conversation between Hermes and Hephaestus at the forge on Lemnos is not recorded in detail in most versions. This is a loss. It must have been interesting. Hermes was the god of, among many other things, communication, and he had a diplomat's understanding of how to frame a message. He would have known that "Your mother is stuck in a chair you made, and we need you to unstick her," was not, technically, an invitation. It was a summons dressed in the language of an invitation, and Hephaestus, for all his quiet nature, was not unintelligent. He would have listened to Hermes with his hammer resting on the anvil and his dark eyes giving away nothing, and then he would have said something like, "Why would I want to go to Olympus?" And Hermes, who had no good answer to this, because the honest answer was, "Because we need something from you, and your mother was terrible to you, and there's no good reason at all, beyond the fact that Zeus has commanded it," would have had to improvise. He is said to have made Hephaestus an offer involving wine, specifically the wine of Olympus, which was considerably better than anything available on Lemnos. This may be the version preserved, because it makes the encounter seem lighter than it was. Makes Hephaestus seem more like a simple, rough craftsman who could be charmed with drink, which is easier to tell than the real story. The real story, probably, is that Hephaestus wanted to go, had always been going to go, not because he was simple or easily swayed, but because the problem of Hera was not finished for him, could not be finished with a trapped throne. That was a beginning, not an end. What he wanted was a conversation. What he needed was for the conversation to happen on terms where he had some power, where he could not simply be dismissed again. The throne had given him that. The net he had woven into it was leverage. He went to Olympus. He rode up on a mule, because the mule was what he had on Lemnos, and he had not yet been invited to the stables of the gods. He rode through clouds that thinned and brightened as he climbed, through air that tasted different, cleaner, more electric, with an underlying sweetness that was the distilled essence of divine power, permeating every molecule of the environment. He arrived to a reception that was, by Olympian standards, awkward. The gods of Olympus were beautiful. This was not something that could be prepared for, even if you had divine blood. They were beautiful the way light is beautiful. Not a quality they possessed, but a quality they were. Apollo with his impossible gold. Athena with her grey eyes that contained something older than her face suggested. Even Ares, brutal and simmering, was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful. They looked at Hephaestus. He looked back. He was broad and dark and walked with a lurch. He smelled of forge smoke. His hands were calloused in ways that divine hands were not supposed to be. He was, by any aesthetic standard current on Olympus, not impressive, except for his eyes. His eyes, which had been ancient since birth, looked at the assembled gods of his family with an expression that was not defiance, and was not submission, and was not quite anything that any of them had seen before. Hermes, who was watching carefully, thought, "Curiosity." The god was curious. Despite everything, despite the fall and the years of exile, and the complicated maneuver of the throne, he was genuinely interested in these people. Chapter 11. The Queen and the God. He went to Hera first. The throne stood in a great hall, and Hera sat in it still, held by the net, her face composed into an expression of regal displeasure that was slightly undercut by the fact that she could not move. She had been there for some time. She would not show discomfort. She was too proud for that. but the set of her jaw had a quality that suggested significant discomfort was happening beneath the composure. Hephaestus stood in front of her and looked at her for a long time. She was beautiful. Of course she was beautiful. She was the queen of the gods. But beyond the beauty, he could see something else. The tension in her that was always there. The anger and the hurt that had calcified over centuries into something like personality. He could see, in the lines around her eyes, in the way she held her shoulders, that she had not been happy for a very long time. He had not expected to feel sympathy. He had not expected to feel anything except the resolution he had brought with him from Lemnos, the clear, focused intention to have the conversation they had never had. But the sympathy came anyway, uninvited, the way sympathy does when you look at someone who is in pain and cannot help seeing past the reasons why the pain is their own fault. "Mother," he said. The word fell into the silence of the hall. It was the first word he had spoken to her, possibly the first word he had spoken at her in either of their lives. Hera's composure cracked. Just for a moment, a flicker of something raw and startled and almost frightened. Then the composure returned, more complete than before, because the crack had frightened her, and she was dealing with the fright by making the walls higher. "Release me," she said. Her voice was controlled, perfect. She was very good at control. "I will," he said. "I came to do that. But first, I want to talk." Chapter 12. What was said? What was said between them is not fully known. The gods were present. Olympus is not a place of privacy, but the conversation is reported in fragments, in incompatible versions, with significant lacunae where the recorders, divine or mortal, either couldn't hear or chose not to repeat what they heard. This is itself telling. It suggests a conversation that was too human, too raw, too much like what passes between parents and children when the wounds are very old and both parties are finally, for whatever reason, unable to sustain their pretenses. Some things are agreed upon. Hephaestus asked why. The question was simple, the way the important questions always are. He had grown up. He had made extraordinary things. He had spent years approaching the question from every angle his considerable intelligence could devise, and he still did not understand why. He needed to hear it from her. Hera did not initially answer the question. She deflected, she explained context, she described the situation with Zeus in terms that were entirely accurate, and also entirely beside the point. Hephaestus listened to all of this with patience, and then, when she had finished, asked again. The second asking got closer. She said something about expectation and disappointment, something about what she had been trying to prove, and how his existence had complicated that proof. She did not say she had been wrong, but the shape of her words acknowledged wrongness in the way that people do when they cannot yet say the word directly. The third asking, by which point Hera's composure had suffered significantly, and she had given up maintaining the perfect regal stillness and was instead gripping the arms of the throne with hands that were not entirely steady. The third asking got to the truth. She had been afraid, she said, not of him, or not exactly. She had been afraid of what she saw in his eyes, something that saw her too clearly, that looked at her the way no one, in all her long divine existence, had ever looked at her, with a kind of gentle, clear, undeceived observation that made her feel, in ways she could not articulate, seen, truly seen. And being truly seen was, for someone who had built her entire existence on a certain carefully curated presentation, the most frightening thing imaginable. She had thrown him away because he made her feel known, and being known was terrifying. The hall was very quiet after this. Hephaestus was quiet for a long time. Then he crouched down, an ungainly movement because of his leg, not dignified in the way that divine movements were supposed to be, to bring his face level with hers. "I still see you that way," he said. "I always have. I always will. That's not something you can throw away." He reached forward and touched the net, a specific place, a key junction that he had built into the design, and it fell away. Hera was free. She did not stand immediately. She sat in the throne he had made for her, free to leave, choosing not to, looking at the sun she had thrown off a mountain. "Stay," she said finally. "Stay on Olympus." This was not an apology. Hera was not capable of a full apology, at least not yet. But it was an opening, and openings were what Hephaestus was good at, finding them, widening them, making something useful and beautiful in the space they offered. "All right," he said. Part 4. The Workshop of the Gods. Chapter 13. Building Heaven. His forge on Olympus was the greatest thing he ever built. He spent the first months on the mountain doing nothing else, planning, measuring, understanding the specific qualities of the place. Its light, its heat, which was different from earthly heat in ways he had to learn. The materials available, which were entirely unlike anything on Lemnos, ore and stone and wood and metals that had no name in any human language. He brought his automatons from Lemnos. They arrived on Olympus in a small procession that caused considerable comment. Bronze figures walking steadily up the path to the mountain, each carrying the tools and materials of his earthly forge, organized with a precision that reflected the years they had spent learning to anticipate his needs. The other gods watched this with varying reactions. Athena watched with undisguised professional interest. Ares found the whole thing vaguely threatening and said so in the direct way that was his custom. Apollo was amused. Aphrodite was not present at this particular moment, or if she was, her reaction was not noted. The forge he built on Olympus occupied a portion of the mountain that had previously been considered unusable. A rocky outcropping where the volcanic nature of the divine peak was closest to the surface, where the Earth's heat was accessible in ways it wasn't elsewhere. He built into the mountain itself, creating chambers and channels that directed the natural heat into working temperatures, supplementing with carefully designed furnaces of his own construction that burned with fire of a quality he had been working toward since Lemnos. It took 3 months. When it was done, the other gods could feel it. A subtle change in the quality of the mountain's energy, as if something that had been potential had become actual, as if a circuit had been completed. He stood in front of it in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, and felt the deep satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Then he went inside and began to work. Chapter 14. The commissions begin. They came, eventually, with requests. This was inevitable. You do not put the greatest craftsman in existence on a mountain with an unlimited supply of divine materials and expect people not to want things. Athena came first, which was appropriate, and she came not with a demand, but with a question. Could he make something she had been thinking about, but had been unable to make herself? She described it. A mechanism for demonstrating the movement of the celestial bodies, the relationships of the spheres, the clockwork of the sky made visible and manipulable, with the precision of someone who had been refining the description in her own mind for a long time. He could, he told her. He would need to think about it. He would need to understand certain things he didn't yet fully understand. He was interested. This was the beginning of a friendship that would be one of the genuine ones of his life. He and Athena were, in certain important ways, the most similar of the Olympians. Both of them gods of making, of skill, of the transformation of raw material through intelligence and application into something new. Athena's making was more conceptual, tactics, strategy, the architecture of thought, while his was material, physical, immediate. But the underlying orientation was the same, and they recognized each other in it. He made her the celestial mechanism. It took him 6 months, and it was so beautiful and so accurate that it became one of the permanent features of Olympus, consulted for millennia by gods and occasional mortal visitors who were permitted to see it. Zeus came next. Zeus came with the assurance of someone who has never needed to ask, only command. And this created a brief and interesting tension, because Hephaestus, who had spent years on Lemnos developing his own authority in the only domain that was truly his, did not respond to commandment the way Zeus was accustomed to. "I work better with specifications than commands," Hephaestus said, with the equanimity of someone who had thought about this moment in advance. "Tell me what you need it to do, and I'll figure out how to make it." Zeus looked at him. This broad, dark son of his wife, who had appeared from an island with ancient eyes and a crooked walk and an absolutely undeniable genius, and made a decision, which was that this was a person worth treating differently than he treated most people. "Fair enough," Zeus said. They talked for an afternoon, Zeus describing his needs, Hephaestus listening, and occasionally asking questions that were so specific and so revealing of how deeply he was already thinking about the problem that Zeus found himself, for the first time in perhaps his entire existence, genuinely impressed by another person's mind. What Hephaestus made for Zeus included the thunderbolts, not the crude approximations that had existed before, but the refined weapons of divine power, perfectly balanced, capable of varying intensities from a concussive shock to the catastrophic lightning strike that could reshape geography. He also made Zeus's aegis, the divine shield mantle that was both weapon and symbol, worked with terrifying imagery that was also somehow deeply beautiful in the way that powerful art about frightening things can be. He made for Apollo a chariot of gold and fire that moved the sun across the sky, light as thought and fast as need. He made for Artemis her silver bow, the one she valued above all other possessions, that fit her hand so perfectly, it seemed grown there rather than made, that shot straight in all conditions and distances. He made for Hermes the winged sandals that could outpace anything mortal or divine. He made for Poseidon a trident that could rearrange the floor of the sea. He made for Demeter irrigation channels in silver and bronze, tiny enough to be held in the hand, that demonstrated the principles of water management he had been developing in his mind since watching the seasons on Lemnos affect the island's crops. She looked at these models and understood them immediately and used them in her domain, and the result was that agriculture became significantly more effective in the regions under her particular care. He made and made and made. Chapter 15. Aphrodite. The marriage was Zeus's idea. This needs to be stated clearly, because in some versions it is made to seem like Hephaestus's ambition, or Aphrodite's scheming, or some other narrative that places the blame or the cause elsewhere. It was Zeus who suggested it, in the confident way of someone who considers himself a good arranger of other people's lives, who believed that giving Hephaestus the most beautiful of the Olympians as a wife was a generous act, a recognition of his value, a proper reward. He did not ask either party. Aphrodite was the goddess of love. This is often taken to mean that she was frivolous or shallow, or simply a personification of physical desire. But this is a misreading, probably driven by the discomfort that certain kinds of people feel about desire being given divine status. She was more complex than her reputation, ancient, powerful, connected to forces that predated the Olympians, a figure whose sphere included not just the light, pleasant forms of love, but its depths and its devastating forms as well. She was not pleased with the arrangement. She did not show this displeasure to Zeus. She was politically sophisticated enough to know when display was unwise, but she did not conceal it from Hephaestus. They met, formally, in the way that betrothed gods were introduced, with ceremony and observation and the performance of divine propriety. Aphrodite was beautiful in a way that even Hephaestus, who had spent years making beautiful things, was not prepared for. Beauty at that level is not merely aesthetic. It has a physical effect, an alteration of the atmosphere around it, a warming of the air, and a change in the quality of light. She looked at him and was honest, in a way that was both cruel and kind. "This is not my choice," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I think poorly of you, but because I deserve to choose." He respected this. He told her so. "I agree," he said, which was not what she expected. "Then we understand each other," she said, and this was the most accurate thing said between them in their entire acquaintance. They were married, the gods celebrated. There was feasting and gift-giving and divine music that could not be reproduced by any mortal instrument. It was, by external appearances, a celebration. Hephaestus and Aphrodite both knew, with clarity that required no discussion, what the marriage actually was, a contractual arrangement that Zeus had imposed on both of them, to which they had both assented because the alternatives were worse, and which they would navigate as best they could. He did not demand her love. This surprised her. She had anticipated demands, possessiveness, jealousy, the various forms that wounded pride takes when attached to a beautiful wife, who clearly does not want to be there. She had prepared arguments, defenses, a whole architecture of self-protection. Instead, he gave her a workshop of her own. Adjacent to his forge, smaller but beautifully appointed, stocked with materials she might use. He had observed her tastes, her particular aesthetics, and arranged things accordingly. He told her it was hers, to do what she wished with. He asked nothing in return. She used it eventually. She made things too, not metalwork, not his domain, but textile and fragrance, and the making of atmosphere, the craft that belongs to beauty's management. She found, to her surprise, that she liked having a place to work, that the act of making was interesting to her in ways she had not previously explored. They were not happy together in the conventional sense. They were something more complicated than happy, and less than what either would have wanted if free choice had been operative. But there was a respect there, eventually, that was real. This made the betrayal harder. Chapter 16. What Ares and Aphrodite did. Ares was beautiful. This has been mentioned, but it bears emphasis in this context. He was the god of war, not the concept of war, not the philosophy of conflict, but the physical, savage, immediate reality of violence. He was that reality made divine and given beauty, and his beauty was of the most dangerous kind, the kind that promises intensity, that suggests depths of feeling, because it comes from someone who has never learned to moderate feeling, to ration it, to consider consequences. Aphrodite knew all this. She was the goddess of love. She understood the mechanisms of desire, as well as anyone in the universe. She understood that what drew her to Ares was in many ways the opposite of wisdom. She went anyway. Perhaps this is the truest thing about her story. Not the scandal of it, not the divine soap opera, but the simple, human, divine reality that people sometimes do things they know are wrong, because the wrongness is inseparable from what makes the thing compelling. They were discreet, in the way that people who believe they are being discreet but are actually merely careless often are. Which is to say, everyone knew. Helios, who drove the sun across the sky with Hephaestus' chariot, saw them because Helios sees everything in the daylight hours. He told Hephaestus. Hephaestus received this information and was quiet for a long time. Then he went to the forge. Chapter 17. The net again. He had been thinking about the design since Lemnos. The first net had been improvised. Brilliant, but improvised, built from a general principle without a specific application in mind. This one would be different. This one he knew exactly what it needed to do. It needed to be invisible, not merely fine, not just difficult to see, but genuinely, functionally invisible. Undetectable not just by eye, but by divine perception, by whatever senses a god used beyond the visual. This required understanding something about the nature of perception itself, which led him into a period of intense thought that was itself a kind of creation, the making of new concepts rather than new objects. He understood through this thinking that perception, even divine perception, was always looking for patterns, for the characteristic signatures of things. Metal had a signature. Structure had a signature. What he needed to make was something that had no signature, or whose signature was indistinguishable from background. He worked on this for weeks before the first strand was made. The making of the net was the greatest technical achievement of his career, and this is not said lightly, given what else he had made. Every element of it represented a solved problem of extraordinary difficulty. The metal was refined to a purity that had no precedent, treated in the forge with techniques he developed specifically for this purpose and never used again. The weaving was accomplished with his own hands and the assistance of his most precise automatons, working at a scale that required instruments he built before he could use them. When it was done, he held it in his hands and could barely feel it. Not light. Weight was not the thing, but present in a way that was almost at the edge of not present, like holding the thought of a thing rather than the thing itself. He hung it above the bed. He set up the trigger, specific pressure, specific location, and made it impossible to disarm from outside without his specific knowledge. He told Aphrodite he needed to go to Lemnos. He said there was work to attend to at the old forge, materials he had left behind. He said he would be gone for several days. He was gone for half a day. He came back to find the net had activated. Chapter 18. The Revelation. The other gods came when they heard. This is one of the more interesting aspects of the story. That Hephaestus, when the net had activated, when Ares and Aphrodite were caught in it, did not simply confront them privately. He called the other gods. He made it public. Why? This question has been debated since the story was first told. The easy answer is shame and revenge. He wanted to humiliate them the way he had been humiliated. But this does not quite fit the character of the man who had built, over decades, a practice of making things that solved problems rather than creating new ones. The better answer is something like evidence. He had been maneuvered by Zeus's arrangement into a marriage that was not of his choosing. The wrongness of that situation, the way he had been given something as a reward that was also a trap, that was unfair to Aphrodite as well as to him, could not be addressed directly, because Zeus did not respond well to direct challenges to his arrangements, but demonstrated wrongness, witnessed by all parties, created a different kind of pressure. He was not trying to punish Ares and Aphrodite. He was creating the conditions under which the arrangement could be undone. The gods who came to witness reacted in their characteristic ways. Apollo found it darkly funny. Hermes found it philosophically interesting, noting that he would not have minded being in Ares's position, which tells you something about Hermes. Poseidon was serious and official and tried to mediate. And Ares, beautiful, fierce, unaccustomed to being caught at anything, was furious in the particular way of people who have been careless and resent being made to face the consequences of their carelessness. Aphrodite, caught alongside him, was not furious. She was in the way of someone who had known this was coming and had done it anyway, almost resigned. She did not beg. She did not rage. She looked at Hephaestus with the expression of someone who is prepared to accept whatever comes next. He released the net. He released it not because of Poseidon's mediation, not because of any promise of compensation or restitution, but because holding them there had served its purpose. The evidence had been witnessed. The wrongness of the situation had been made undeniable. He let them go. To Ares he said nothing. To Aphrodite he said, "You deserved the chance to choose." She left with Ares. This is what the story records. She left with the god she had wanted and had chosen even knowing it was unwise. Hephaestus went back to his forge. He worked for 3 days without stopping, which was not unusual for him, and what he made in those 3 days has not been recorded. Sometimes the most important work is private. Part 5. The Long Making. Chapter 19. Achilles' Shield. Years passed, decades, centuries. Olympus exists outside ordinary time, and the gods within it are spared the specific anxiety of human temporality. There is no awareness for them of running out of time, no shadow of ending cast over the present moment. For Hephaestus, this meant simply more time to work. The commissions continued, became more ambitious, became the defining projects of their respective eras. He made things whose names are known even now. The golden tripods that moved themselves through the halls of Olympus, the bronze giant Talos that guarded Crete, the necklace of Harmonia, whose beauty was its own catastrophe. But the greatest commissioned work of his career, in most reckonings, was the shield of Achilles. The request came from Thetis, not the woman of Lemnos who shared the name, but the sea goddess herself, ancient and silver, mother of the greatest of mortal warriors. She came to his forge in the small hours, when the mountain was quiet and the fire was banked. And she came with urgency and grief, combined in proportions that only mothers with sons in danger can understand. Her son's armor had been taken. Her son would fight without protection in the morning. She had come to the only one who could help. He made the shield that night. This is the part of his story that the poets most love to tell, and they were right to love it, because what he did that night was more than smithcraft. He created a world in metal. The shield was large enough that a warrior needed both arms to hold it. Its surface was divided in concentric circles, and in each circle he depicted something of the world, as it was and as it had been. He made cities in celebration and cities in conflict. He made fields at harvest and vineyards at vintage, the entire cycle of the agricultural year compressed into a circle of worked gold and silver. He made the sea around the rim of the whole, silver sea in silver metal, and in the sea he put great fish and the suggestion of depth. He made dances, the details of human festivity rendered with such accuracy and sympathy that any person who saw it would feel, looking at those tiny dancing figures, the kinesthetic memory of having danced themselves. He made a wedding procession and a legal dispute, the full range of ordinary human activity, the things that happen when no one is making war or sailing seas or pursuing glory. He made it beautiful, and he made it true, and the truth of it was not the kind that flatters. The world he put in the shield contained suffering and joy in proportions roughly equal, and did not suggest that one could exist without the other. Why this for a warrior's shield? Why, on an instrument designed for protection in combat, depict the whole texture of ordinary life? Because he had spent a long time thinking about what war was for, what it protected, what the purpose of the fight was, if there was one. And he had decided, not that day, but over the long centuries of making weapons for gods and heroes, that the things most worth protecting were the ordinary ones. The dancing, the harvest, the disputes at law that substituted argument for violence, the wedding processions. These were what was actually at stake. Thetis took the shield to Achilles in the grey morning before the battle. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put it on and walked toward the enemy. Chapter 20. The Teaching. In the later centuries, after the wars of heroes, after the great cycles of human mythology had played out their consequences, Hephaestus became a teacher. This was not how he described it. He would have said he was simply working, and that occasionally people were around while he worked. But the effect was the same. Mortal craftsmen, some of them, were brought to the edge of Olympus, not to the mountain itself, which remained inaccessible to the unclean mortal body, but to places where the divine influence was strong, where the quality of fire and metal was different from the ordinary world. These were mostly people who had already demonstrated unusual ability, who had made something that attracted divine attention the way certain human achievements did. He worked alongside them. He did not lecture. He worked, and they watched, and occasionally he would stop and look at what they were doing and say something brief, a correction, a suggestion, a question that pointed at the problem without solving it for them. He was a better teacher than he was given credit for being in the accounts that have come down, because the best teaching is often invisible, and visible teaching is often less effective than it appears. The crafts spread. Knowledge that had its origin in his divine understanding was diluted and adapted and imperfectly transmitted through generations of mortal craftspeople, each one doing their best with the fragment they had received, adding their own understanding to it. The result, over centuries, was the human tradition of metalwork and craft that eventually produced everything from the first copper tools to the most intricate clockwork, to the engines of the industrial age. He watched this from Olympus with something that might be called pride and might be called love. The thing he felt watching humans make things was not the patronizing affection of a god toward creatures incapable of approaching divine excellence. It was more like recognition. He saw in their best work, in the best of what they could do with their limited time and their mortal hands and their briefly burning intelligence, something that rhymed with what he did, that participated in the same essential activity. Making was making. The divine and mortal versions were different in degree, not in kind. Chapter 21. A Conversation with Athena. There was an evening, and evenings on Olympus have a quality of golden amber suspension that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not been there. When Hephaestus and Athena sat together in his workshop and talked about what they were doing. Not a specific project, not the current commission or the recent work. The general question of what they were doing when they made things, what was the purpose of it, what they were for. Athena had been thinking about the relationship between making and knowing. She was a goddess of wisdom as well as craft, and she had noticed over a long career that the deepest knowledge came from making, that there was an understanding available to the hands, to the person working in material, that the pure intellect could not access through thought alone. You had to make something to understand it completely. You had to struggle with its material reality, with the resistance it offered, with the gap between the thing in your mind and the thing your hands could produce. Hephaestus listened to this and agreed, and then said something that surprised her. He thought the opposite was also true, that making without thinking was equally limited, that the hand needed the mind, and the mind needed the hand, that the separation of them, in education, in how people thought about intelligence, was a mistake that cost everyone who made it. The cleverest design, he said, that has never been built, that has never had to face the fact of material, is not as clever as it thinks it is. Material teaches you things that thought cannot anticipate. He showed her something he was working on. A joint, a mechanical joint for one of his automatons that he had been revising for weeks. He showed her successive versions of it, each one better than the last. Each improvement the result of building the previous version and discovering where it failed. I could not have designed the final version from the first, he said. I had to make all the wrong ones first. She looked at the joint with her gray eyes that saw so clearly and said, "This is what humility looks like in practice." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." Part 6. The True Nature of the Work. Chapter 22. What he was building. The centuries accumulated. The gods of Olympus, being immortal, did not change in the way mortals change. They did not age visibly, did not accumulate the physical evidence of years. But they changed in other ways, as all minds do with sufficient time, deepening, becoming more fully themselves, the essential qualities of their nature becoming more concentrated and refined. Hephaestus became more Hephaestus with each passing century, more patient, more precise, more interested in problems that had no obvious solution. The satisfaction he took in his work did not diminish. If anything, it grew, the way a musician's love of music tends to grow rather than diminish with mastery. He had, in those centuries, thought about the question of what he was building, not any specific object, the general project, the lifetime of work taken as a whole. What was its purpose? What did it add up to? What was he actually doing when he stood at the forge and turned raw material into something new? He had arrived at an answer, or something that felt like an answer, the way conclusions feel in minds that have been working on something for a very long time. He was building the world's capacity to make things. Each object he created was itself, yes, a shield or a gate or a throne or an automaton. But it was also an example. It demonstrated what was possible, expanded the range of what could be imagined, showed both gods and mortals that the boundary between the actual and the possible was always further out than they had thought. Every time he solved a problem that had been considered unsolvable, he made the category of unsolvable smaller. And the mortals who came after him, who learned imperfect fragments of his methods, and developed those fragments, and discovered their own methods, and added those to the common store, they were, in a meaningful sense, continuing his work. The chain was long and imperfect, and full of loss as well as gain, knowledge forgotten as well as knowledge gained, but it was continuous. He could trace it. This was not a modest conclusion. It had the quality of something large. But he had arrived at it over a very long time, and the scale of it did not frighten him, because he had long since made peace with working on things that exceeded his own finite capacity to complete. He had been made for this. He had been given, in the seemingly accidental circumstances of his creation and his casting away, exactly the nature that the work required: patient, precise, uninterested in glory for its own sake, interested in problems for their own sake, capable of returning to the forge every day and doing what needed to be done even when nothing was rewarded and no one was watching. Hera had made him alone, in anger and wounded pride, and had thrown him away because he was not what she had intended. And from that combination, the divine spark of her power, the crooked walk, the years on Lemnos with nothing but a forge in the sea, had come exactly what the world needed. This was not something he would have chosen to say aloud. The insight was too large for words, too close to what the philosophers would later call teleology, the dangerous idea that everything happens for a reason. He did not believe that everything happens for a reason. He had seen too much suffering that served no purpose, too much loss that yielded nothing but more loss. But he believed that something could be made of what happened, that the materials, however they arrived, could always be worked, that the job of a craftsman, of any craftsman, mortal or divine, was to take what you had been given and see what was possible with it. He had been given a fall from a great height and years of exile, and a crooked leg and hands that understood metal the way other hands understood nothing. And from these materials, he had made a life that was taken whole, extraordinary. Chapter 23. The fires still burn. He is still there. This is the thing about the divine. They do not end, or do not end in any time frame that human reckoning can encompass. The gods persist, and Hephaestus persists in the way that is most characteristic of him, working. The forge is never cold. The automatons, more sophisticated now than anything he made in those first centuries, move through the workshop with the accumulated grace of beings who have been learning their tasks since before the oldest human civilization had learned to smelt copper. He takes commissions from gods who still need things, and from mortals who find their way to him through the channels that still exist. The inspired craftsperson who works all night on something they cannot explain. The engineer who has a solution to a problem that seems to come from outside their own knowledge. The artist whose hands know something that their mind has not yet caught up to. He does not appear to them directly. He is subtle in the way that divine influence at its best tends to be. Not supernatural intervention that bypasses the person's own agency, but something more like a whisper in the quality of the work, a nudge toward the right angle, a suggestion that comes in the gap between hammer blows. He remembers Lemnos. He remembers the fall, remembers it not as wound but as origin story. The way that stories which begin in loss can become, given enough time and work, stories about something else entirely. He remembers the first fire he built with his own hands on that volcanic island, the forge he assembled from earth and leather and divine stubbornness. The first time the bellows breath hit the coals, and the heat rose to working temperature, and he lifted a hammer and understood, with the full weight of certainty, what he was. He was a maker. He remains a maker. The fires still burn. Epilogue. In praise of crooked gods. There is something worth saying about Hephaestus that the Greeks mostly said between the lines, and that later traditions have sometimes missed. He was the only Olympian who worked. Not worked in the administrative sense, managing domains and handling prayers, but actually worked, with his hands, at a craft, in a process that was unglamorous and required daily application, and sometimes produced failure, and sometimes produced the most extraordinary things in the world. He was the only Olympian who visibly fell short of perfection. Every other god on the mountain was, by design, the embodiment of their domain, radiant, complete, the platonic ideal of whatever they represented. Aphrodite was beauty itself. Apollo was the perfection of light and art and prophecy. Hephaestus was the god of the forge, and he walked with a limp, and he smelled of smoke, and his hands were calloused. This is not, the poets insist without quite saying it, a failure in the design. This is the point. You cannot make extraordinary things while remaining pristine. The work gets on you. The material you work with changes you. The failures that are necessary to any real craft. The tests that don't work. The joints that break. The weeks of effort that produce something that must be discarded because it is not right. These leave marks. Physical marks on calloused hands. Psychic marks on the specific kind of patience that only develops in people who have failed at hard things and returned to the bench. A god who made things without effort, without cost, without the marks of the work on their person, would not be making things at all, would be performing the appearance of making, conjuring objects by divine fiat, producing results without process. Hephaestus was the god of the actual process, of what making actually is. This is why his worshippers were craftspeople, working people, the people who spent their lives in the struggle between intention and material. They recognized themselves in him, not in the divine fire of his genius necessarily, but in the crooked walk, in the understanding that the work requires your whole self, that you cannot give partial attention to something and receive the full result. In the daily returning to the forge when the day before had produced nothing worth keeping. He was thrown from a great height, and fell for a day and a night, and landed wrong and grew up in exile, and was given a marriage he did not want, and made the greatest things in the history of the universe from a workshop that smelled of smoke. He was among the gods the most human, and he was, among the gods, the one who built the most. This ends the historic tale of Hephaestus. I hope you enjoyed this story as you slowly drift off to slumberland.